Reader, come closer. I have just finished this lovely book, The Will of the Many, and I was just going through it to see what exactly just happened in this one, because the sequel to this one, The Strength of the Few, is coming out very shortly. Depends on when this video finally sees light of day. It is either gonna be tomorrow or it has already happened and I'm late. But so, without further ado guys, I'm here to give you guys a recap for The Will of the Many. It is not going to be a recap that contains every single thing that happens within this book and every single detail within it, because then you may as well read it. But it is going to be an attempt at giving you an overview of everything that happens within this book that may be of importance for the sequel. Obviously, I have not read the sequel, so I cannot be sure what exactly is of importance and what isn't. So before going into this, let me give the most obvious disclaimer of disclaimers. This is going to be a spoiler-filled video because, yeah, what else are we gonna do? Like, I cannot give you a recap or a summary of a book without spoiling what happens within it. And then at the end of this video, I might also do a little bit of a speculation section in which I go over my thoughts about what is going to be coming within the second book. So, I'll be filming this in two sections, I think, because my poor voice, and if you hear some banging occasionally in the background, that is because my upstairs neighbor is basically moving in, and so for the past few days there's been a lot of drilling, so this knocking sound is basically the fewest amount of sounds I've heard in the last few days, so I have to take opportunity to film at some point, right? But so, let's go into it. Let's start off with just a little bit of world building. So basically we have a world, and this world changed very much after the cataclysm. However, we don't really know what the cataclysm is. At the end of this book, I still have no idea what the cataclysm is, unless I missed something major, but we do have often references to what is known as pre-cataclysm ruins or pre-cataclysm items, and one of the things that is, for example, pre-cataclysm is this structure known as the Aurora Columni, which will play a major role within the sort of like magic system of this world. Aside from that, the history of this world contains a little bit of a brutal grab for power on the side of the Catalan Empire. The Catalan Empire has been brutally expanding, taking a lot of different nations that weren't part of the empire yet and submitting them to the control of the empire. And one of its most recent victories was over the island of Zeus, which will play a major role because this is where this is the birthplace basically of our protagonist. Now, the reason why the Catalan Empire has been able to expand to this extent seems to be their use of a power that is known as the will. Basically, the will is a sort of pyramid scheme where basically the people at the lowest rung of society, they cede part of their will to the ones above, and the ones above get will from the ones below them, but also cede once again to the people above them. So by the end of it, when you get to the top of the pyramid, the person at the top of the pyramid is getting will from a whole range of people further down until the lowest rung of the pyramid. And then they can use this will, for example, to imbue certain objects. So they can move objects, for example, with the use of their will, but they can also use it in terms of physical strength, making themselves that much more stronger, giving themselves the power of multiple men rather than just their one. And especially when it comes to the island of Zeus, this power was very much a power that is loaded by the people of Zeus, and so it was the power that they did not have at their disposal, and so they could not resist the power of the Catalan Empire, and they had to fall as a consequence. And the fall of Zeus is going to play a major role within our story, of course, because as I said, our protagonist is from Zeus, and most importantly, he was actually one of the princes of Zeus. So our protagonist is called Vis, but he is secretly known by another name because his real name is Diago. And Diago was a prince of Zeus. He grew up there, he was trained there to potentially become the leader of Zeus one day. So he has been trained in a lot of different languages, dead languages, and languages that were actually in circulation at the time. He has been taught history, mathematics, all of the different skills that he would potentially need as a leader. And his father was also very much concerned with teaching him sort of like the tactical side of being a leader, and basically giving certain scenarios to his son for his son to work through and kind of figure out what his response is, what he thinks that his father should do in those scenarios, and then talk those decisions through. However, 3 years ago, the Catalan Empire attacked the island of Zeus, and they killed off the entire royal family. However, his father managed to get his son Vis and his sister out, and he had to basically drop them into the ocean to try and get them to survive that way. Unfortunately, his sister died in that attempt, and Vis was the only one left surviving. Vis has basically been struggling to survive in the meantime, struggling to try and get by on his own without any sort of real money to his name, without any power to his name. He has been using a lot of survival skills. However, at some point in time, he did have to kind of hand himself into the Catalan Empire to be able to have them provide at least in his basic means. However, he has still defied their sort of like expectation for people to cede their wills. And the way that people cede their will is they go to these Aurora columni, which I referred to earlier, which are pre-cataclysm remnants, and basically you go there and go through some sort of a ritual, and as a consequence then you can start to cede will to people. We don't really have much of an explanation of how it works. We don't even know if they really know how it works in any case. But so Vis has basically been living in an orphanage in Leetons, is the city that he is living in, and he's basically there just sort of like getting by, getting his sustenance. He's very much loaded by the person who's running the orphanage, because he will not cede will, which kind of reflects badly on her as the owner of this orphanage, because whenever people come in to look for somebody that they might want to adopt, one of the key reasons why people are looking for somebody to adopt is because they want that person to cede will to them. And however, every single time that they have then had an interview with Vis as a potential adopted son, these interviews run very badly, of course, because Vis will not cede his will to anybody. Now, Vis is running a side job. This is the way that he has been able to keep his position within the orphanage. He is working at a local prison, and at this prison, the prisoners are basically kept on these sort of like stone slabs, which are referred to as sappers, and they basically sap the will of these people. So normally ceding will is a voluntary action, but if you end up in a prison like this, then of course your will is basically taken from you and fed into the rest of the empire against your will. Now, this is a position that is not highly coveted, because these sappers have a very big impact on the people around them, and so typically it's a job that you cannot hold for too long, because it will mentally deteriorate the person who is in contact with these sappers for such a long period of time. Touching it is like a no-go. It will definitely harm you, but even being around it is a little bit on a has a little bit of a negative impact, in that we can see when it comes to Vis's companion in the prison, because this guy is definitely somebody who has been exposed to these sappers for a little bit too long, and so he might probably need to be replaced soon, which Vis is very much dreading, because he basically has this sort of like arrangement going on with his current fellow guard that he would have to negotiate again with a new person if somebody else is there to replace him. But on the night that our story begins, they are visited by a person called Hospius, who claims to be a sextus, and he is there to interrogate a guard called Matteo. He has all of the paperwork, so his paperwork seems to be in order, but Vis has this sort of like feeling that something is wrong. However, he accepts that the paperwork is in order, and he decides to take Hospius down with him in order to spare his fellow prison guard, because he feels that Hospius might be able to tell that something is wrong with this fellow prison guard, and might inform the authorities, and then Vis would have to go through all those changes immediately. So he takes Hospius down into the prison towards these sappers to release Nateo from the mechanism, and once he's recovered a little bit, Hospius and Nateo have a conversation in what is thought to be a dead language, and what Hospius therefore believes to be a private conversation. And in this conversation there are a few terminology that is basically floated around. One of the main thing that is mentioned is the name of Viridius. Vis does not have any context to this conversation, and he tries not to let on that he can actually speak this that language, and so that therefore he's able to hear this entire exchange. And once Nateo is kind of understanding that, you know, Hospice is not there to get him out, he's not there to remove him from the sapper permanently, he tries to make a run for it. They end up restraining him, and in the process Vis falls against the sapper, which luckily for him doesn't really have an impact on him, as he seems to be immune to the powers of these sapper. They are able to put Nateo back into the sapper, and as they go up, Hospius seems to be asking a few more pointed questions towards Vis. Vis, who's basically just been trying to keep a low profile because, you know, nobody knows his real identity, and if they were to know, he would be ending up in one of these sappers and he would have been made to cede his will. As Hospius leaves, Vis gets ready to move on to his second job of the night, because basically he also runs fights within a sort of like establishment nearby. When he arrives there, he's informed that he actually has to fight a Sextus this time around, which is very unfair because of course a Sextus is going to be way stronger than him. However, he is able to negotiate some very good betting odds with the sort of person who's running the betting ring over there, who also informs him that his secret admirer is once again there to cheer him on. Vis starts the fight against this Sextus, and the Sextus kind of goads him, kind of baits him, to the point where Vis is fully enraged and just really goes off on him, and he ends up winning the fight against all odds. This does have the unfortunate effect that he is fired from this job. He can no longer take on fights within this establishment. He does get his money from his bets, luckily, but he no longer has this source of income to go off of in the future. And this is basically his only source of income, because as we see later on, when he returns to the orphanage, the money that he gets from working in the prison is actually money that he has to hand over back into the orphanage. So basically the only funding that he's been saving up for whenever the time comes that he will have to go on the run, that what he was getting that money from the fighting ring, and he no longer has that option now. The next day his fortunes change, because basically somebody shows up at the orphanage who's looking for somebody to adopt, and his name is also Ulciscor Telemus. And once Vis is basically put into his vicinity, Vis recognizes him as being Hospius. So he's not a Sexton at all, he's actually a Quintus, and Ulciscor indicates that he realized that Vis was able to understand his conversation with Nateo. Vis originally tries to pretend like he doesn't know what Ulciscor is talking about, but at some point Ulciscor kind of tricks him by speaking the language he was speaking to Nateo, and Vis has some sort of a visceral reaction to it that he cannot hide afterwards. Ulciscor proceeds to ask quite a lot of questions, kind of testing the boundaries of his knowledge and of his language skills and etc. And then he proposes for him to adopt Vis. Now, Vis doesn't really see much of an option out, of course, because, you know, Ulciscor does know a lot more about Vis than Vis is comfortable with people knowing, but also Vis is basically kind of stuck in his situation. He is of an age where it's still somewhat acceptable for him to not cede will, but at some point in time in the next few years this will change, and people will absolutely start to demand him ceding will, which he definitely does not want to do, and so at that point in time it would have to go on the run. And he's hoping that by choosing to go with Ulciscor, who's basically indicated that he understands that Vis's reason for being able to resist the power of the sapper was the fact that he's never ceded before. He indicates that he is happy for that to remain that way. He does not need Vis to cede will if he adopts him, and so this is sort of like his best out for his best way out for the time being is to go along with Ulciscor and see what this brings him. As they're making their way to Ulciscor's house, they basically have to use this mode of transportation, which is known as a transfect, which is basically what you see on the cover of The Will of the Many. This is this like big platform that through sorts of like will-based magnetism is basically drawn to an end point, and this is what they use to move about. However, the transfect has an accident along the way and is basically kind of shot out of the sky, let's say it like that. Ulciscor, with his will, is able to save Vis from the most of the impact, but when they make it to ground, there are basically these people who are waiting for them and who are attacking them. Ulciscor is able to take one of these down, but then he's shot in the leg with an arrow that takes him down in its place. And at that point in time, a woman emerges from the woods who wants to speak to Vis, and it's the woman who was secretly admiring him for all of these matches within the fighting rink. It turns out that she was actually trying to establish contact with Vis because she knows his real identity. She knows that he is a Prince of Zeus. She is part of this group called the Anguis, who is basically like the biggest resistance to the Catalan Empire at this point in time, and she would like for him to join them. However, Vis has had some bad experiences with the Anguis in his years on the run. And at one point in time, he was basically held by this little village, and then when he went back to that little village, it was totally destroyed, and the Anguis were the one responsible. So they are fighting the Catalan Empire, but they are also fighting tooth and nail. They are going full out. They do not hold back. They are, to some extent, just as bad as the Catalan Empire in Vis's eyes, and so he does not want to work together with them, which is something that this woman, Zodacia, is quite angered by, because they would love to take him away from there and prepare him, because in her words, he is not ready to face Ulciscor and his many questions, and he will not be able to hide his true identity from Ulciscor. However, Vis refuses, which she ultimately just has to accept and move on from, because they don't want to take him against his will either, because they ultimately do want his consent. So she accepts for him to return together with Ulciscor. However, she does indicate that she will be looking for him at the Festival of Joven at the Naumachia, and that he has to make his way there, or otherwise she will spread the word about his true identity to the whole world. Now, Vis loses consciousness, I think, at this point in time, and when he regains consciousness, he's basically at the academy where Ulciscor was taking him in order to basically sign him up, register him, because basically Ulciscor had kind of indicated that this was his true goal. He wants Vis to basically become his spy at this academy and grow in the ranks in order to be able to make it to the sort of like final test that happens every year and be able to find out what happens there, because Ulciscor's brother Cairor was killed or died during this contest, and he wants to figure out what happened, and he blames the principal of the school, who is a man called Viridius. When Vis awakens in the academy, he is basically spotted by a few of the students there who want to kind of know, who is this guy, is he, what is his deal, and he is handed a glass of water by one of them, which he accepts gladly because he's very much parched. However, he shouldn't have, because later it turns out that there was actually poison in it. But the students are basically kind of turned away by this guy who comes in to attend to Vis and see to his wounds, who asks a few questions, nothing too probing, but he's definitely like kind of figuring out Vis and his circumstances. However, when Ulciscor enters, it turns out that this guy was actually the principal of his school himself, Viridius. However, Vis is pretty confident that he didn't really like ruin any schemes, he didn't really say anything that Viridius couldn't have heard. Basically, they at this point in time make their way further along towards the mansion of Ulciscor, where he is introduced to a woman called Lanistia, who is going to be in charge of training him. She originally isn't too happy with this news. She was not prepared for this fact. She did not know that Ulsisker had anybody in mind to adopt. She's also a little bit worried about the fact that he didn't even inform his wife of the fact that he has adopted anybody, but she will take him on regardless. And originally their training goes a little bit rough because like in the first night when he's in this mansion, she wakes him up in the middle of the night, attacking him, basically getting him ready to realize that he needs to be prepared for anything. Now, Lanistia has no eyes anymore. Her eyes have basically been kind of gauged out. However, she's wearing these sort of like glasses so that initially Viz didn't really realize, and then it turns out that she's basically using will to be able to see. She's basically sending out these pulses 20,000 times or whatever, in 20 times I think a second, to be able to see motion around her. And she is a tough teacher. You know, she spares no punishments. You know, she is very much hard on him. She's not easily pleased. You know, when he's giving all of these answers to her questions and thinking that he's doing well, she's not praising him for it. She's basically just like constantly indicating that he's not as far along as she would like for him to be. He's not ready to go to the academy. And one of the main things that he's being trained on in his time there is running the labyrinth. So the labyrinth is this big maze that has these stone slabs that you can basically move with a bracer to your arm. And this is basically a test that is copied from the academy. It's copied without consent. Nobody knows that this maze is there on Ulsisker's lands. And this is basically one of the main tests that the academy uses to try and prepare people for the use of the will. And so something that Viz will absolutely need to be able to master in order for him to be able to climb high enough within the academy. So he is going along with his training as usual. During his training time, there's also a person who visits who is basically the neighbor to Ulsisker. However, there's no love lost between the two of them. And he's basically somebody from the Senate who kind of indicates to Viz as well that he's in a little bit of a dangerous position going into the academy, because everybody knows that Ulsisker blames Viridius for the death of Cairor, and so basically indicating that he should be on his toes. And he asks Viz for a favor. He asks him to be able to train along with his daughter Aqua the last few weeks before they go off to the academy. Now, Viz doesn't really have any other option. He has to kind of say yes to this, because this is a it's not a quintus, I think it's the rank higher even, so, but in any case this is a highly placed individual within the hierarchy, so he cannot just say no, so he has to say yes. However, he manages to take some profit out of it as well, because he had been wondering how he was able to go to the Festival of Jovan, because nobody seemed to be really interested in him going there. So he extracts a exchange from this person saying like, okay, I will train with your daughter Aqua for the last few weeks if she goes with me to the Festival of Jovan, to the Namakya. And so they set off to the capital, Ketan, to go to this Namakya. Lanistia was not very excited about it, but of course he could not go back on his word. As he's traveling there, he kind of has an opportunity to speak with Aqua and clarify some of the points that her father made, because her father kind of indicated that everybody knows that Cairor committed suicide, and that Ulsisker just isn't able or willing to accept that news. And so Aqua kind of indicates that he committed suicide because he thought that he had severely wounded somebody at this sort of like final test that happens in the academic year, which is known as the Udicium, I think. They make their way over to the capital. They make their way over to the arena that is to host the Namakya, which is basically some sort of a big reproduction of a naval battle. So it's a big arena that is filled with water and real ships, and there are basically all of these slaves aboard these ships that will recreate this battle, and this is an opportunity for them to escape sappers, because you know, if they fail at this task, then they will be put into a sapper, otherwise not. Now, before the Namakya is starting, Viz takes the opportunity to kind of ask for to kind of sneak away for a little bit, indicating that he's going to relieve himself. However, this is the time in which he's going to look for Sedacia, who very quickly draws his attention and leads him into the sewer system, where he is met by a man who he knows very well because he is one of the advisors to his father, and he is a guy called Esteban, who is apparently known by the name of Melchior in the Catalan Empire, and he's basically the leader of the Anguis rebellion. Now Esteban tries to recruit Vis once more, however Vis is unwilling to join him. He does not want to join the Anguis, still doesn't, and Esteban is indicating that, you know, if he only knew the reason why the Zeus Empire was attacked, that he would change his mind like that. However, he's still unwilling to actually tell Vis what that reason was. Now, he leaves the sewers and he's given a special weapon that is kind of bound to his blood by Sedacia, and when he takes his place, the festival starts. However, it's very soon interrupted because there's a voice that kind of rings out across the stadium that basically indicates that all of the people there are accomplices to the hierarchy. Hierarchy, by the way, is another way that the Catalan Empire is referred to. It's kind of the way that the enemies to the Catalan Empire seem to refer to the Catalan Empire. And so he's indicating that all the people there are accomplices because all of them are ceding their will. And then he basically uses some sort of strange power that nobody really understands in order to blow up people within the stance. Now, people try to reach Esteban, however they're unable to reach him. It seems like their will is also kind of like turned off. They cannot use their will against Esteban, and Vis, basically in the panic that ensues, Vis is able to guide Aqua towards the sewers that he had used earlier in order for her to be able to escape the arena. Aqua is already a little bit like not really worried, but like suspicious of the fact that Vis sees these things and spots this way out. However, you know, she wants to get out as well, so she's just following along. However, when they reach the safety of the sewers, Vis turns back and he's like, yeah, okay, go to safety, but I have to see if there's anything more that I can do. So Vis returns into the arena. He has already kind of thought through the implications of what has happened and figured out that probably the stylus, the weapon that he was given by Aqua, by Sedacia, was actually immune to this power that Esteban is using, and that he will be able to reach Esteban where nobody else is able to do so. So he makes his way to the center of the arena towards Esteban. He seems to be somewhat immune to the power that is emitting from Esteban. However, he does kind of feel weird sensations as a consequence of it, and he spots an image of a black pyramid in his mind as well when he's like just about to reach Esteban. And considering the cover for the second book, I think that that is probably significant. He reaches Esteban, who basically is still going at it, and the only way for him to stop him would be to kill him. However, he's still unable to do so, but Esteban basically takes it upon himself and kind of falls onto the stylus that Vis was keeping to his throat. Vis, in the sort of like release of power that happens because of killing Esteban, Vis loses consciousness, and when he regains consciousness, he's basically back in the mansion, and it's basically just like 1 week until he has to go to the academy. He now has been formally adopted by Ulsisker in the meantime, and he's basically now being referred to as Catanicus, the hero of the Naumachia. So he's definitely going to go to the academy with quite some praise and fame to his name. They try to do the last few preparations that they're able to do, but there's not that much that they can do, of course, and his deal with Aqua's father kind of fell through because obviously, as he has been recovering from the incident in the Naumachia, he was unable to fulfill his end of the deal. He makes his way to the academy, where he is a little bit later than all of the other students. He's joining later, and so he's also joining with a little bit of a how do you call that? yeah, I don't know how to say that. So he has to catch up for lost time, basically, is what I'm trying to say. When he gets to the academy, he is also greeted by Viridius, who basically takes him to the dormitory for the 7th years. Basically, the academy also has this rank system by years, and so you climb your way up to the highest rank, which is the 3rd years. Viridius basically indicates that, you know, everybody of course knows Vis now. They all know about Catanicus and his big acts within the Naumachia, and he also already points out the fact that he realizes that, you know, Ulciscor is blaming Viridius for the death of Cairor, and that probably Ulciscor has asked him to do certain things for him. So he's being very jovial about it and indicating to Vis, like, you will be treated no differently, and you will be treated no differently both for the heroics that happened in the Naumachia, but also for the acts that I'm sure Ulciscor wants you to perform. But that as long as he sticks to the rules of this academy, as long as he performs the way that he should perform, nothing will be held against him or in his favor. However, if he were to break any rules, then he's also like going to be treated like all of the other students. It isn't because of the incident with Cairor that Viridius would potentially like let things slide. He is indicating up front, like, okay, I know that you were probably up to something, and you know, I won't hold that against you, but also if you're going to be breaking the rules, then you have to comply with the consequences. He introduces Vis to a boy called Calidus, who is inside the dormitory when they enter there, and basically asking Calidus to show him to basically the mess where they can go and have some food. Now, once they arrive in the mess hall, there's this boy called Aidhin who basically confronts Calidus and who seems to want to attack Calidus. However, Vis steps in and he throws the punch. And that is not a good decision, because it's actually against the rule to attack any other student, especially a student that is of a higher rank than you are, and so this is actually already grounds for expulsion. So Vis has been there for like half an hour and he's already on the brink of expulsion. However, as they are discussing his case, Vis is able to make a trifold apology, I think it's referred to, which seems to be sort of like formal apology scheme, and as long as that is accepted by Aidhin, then it would mean that he forfeits any right to withdraw an accusation and that Vis would not be expulsed. And because Aidhin is actually not a natural inhabitant of the Catalan Empire, he does not even know about this, so he accepts Vis's apology and Vis walks free. Now, Vis enters into class 7 and it's very early on clear to him that this level is very much beneath his level. He is very well prepared for this level, and so he also rises in the ranks pretty early on. Calidus on his end is kind of trying to warn him, kind of indicating like, are you sure you want to go there? Because Calidus was actually in class 3 at some point, and his performance there was so poorly that he dropped down all the way to level 7 again at the end. But he is basically indicating like, are you sure you want to go down that road? Because, you know, this is a cutthroat world, and, you know, going all the way to the top, it is not without its sacrifices. But yeah, Vis, of course, we know, has an ulterior motive to make his way there, and so he will not be stopped. He is placed into group 6, which is basically the group that Aidhin is in, and wonder by wonder, the sort of like dormitory that he ends up in is exactly the one that Aidhin is also in. However, luckily Aidhin does not appear to be holding a grudge, and so they get along just fine, ignoring one another. Vis does kind of break with like tradition by going to sit with Calidus again over during the dinner times, because none of the 6 really want to be around him after the incident with Aidhin. And while Aidhin isn't really hostile, he also doesn't really want to share the table with Vis neither. Now, the 6th actually have a activity that the 7th never had, because this is like the first rank at which they start to run the labyrinth. Now, the running of the labyrinth happens a little bit differently here, because here they always like team up. There's always one person who's running the labyrinth and the other one who's controlling the bracer, whereas he's always been trained to do both at the same time. And their first run together isn't very successful, because basically being the 2 lowest ones in the ranking, Vis and Aiden are kind of squared off with one another. However, on their second run, Vis is able to surprise everybody by speaking the native language of Aiden and thus guiding him through the maze. However, their teacher, who's very much of a you know, prick, he basically considers this as breaking the rules, and so they are disqualified, and for the rest of his time within group 6 he's basically avoiding them running the labyrinth at all. But one thing that does also stand out here is that Viridius actually came to watch them do their first run, because it seems like he definitely does have a little bit of a special interest in Vis, trying to see like what force he has to reckon with, because he knows that Ulsisker has basically sent this boy here to infiltrate the academy, so I'm sure he just wants to know what he's up against. Now, Vis has not been making a lot of progress at all in academically speaking, because as I indicated, the teacher for group 6 really hates him, which Viridius explains to Vis is due to the fact that Viridius, basically after the death of Kyror, the people who were basically like at the top of the academy were this teacher of group 6 and the teacher of group 3, and they were planned to be the next principal of the school, and as a consequence of Kyror's death they were demoted, and it was actually Viridius who became principal over them, and of course they hold a little bit of a grudge towards the Telemus name as a consequence. Now, so Vis is basically stuck in group 6 unless he's able to make something massive happen. He just isn't able to yet figure out how he's going to make that happen. However, he decides that he does have to make work of some of the things that Ulsisker has asked him to do, because basically Ulsisker's main goal was for Vis to get to the very top of the academy in order to see what is happening, but he also has pointed him in the direction of 2 pre-cataclysm ruins that are on this island of Solvagus, and he is about to explore the first one of these. He has been working in the evenings in these stables as part of his punishment over punching Aiden, and one of these nights in which he is in the stables, he uses that opportunity to hop a fence in order to make his way over to this ruin. When he enters into the ruin, he's kind of mentally already calculating like, okay, how much time do I have down here in case there's some sort of a security alarm that has just been triggered by me opening the door. He enters into the temple. There is some sort of writing on the wall that he can to some extent read, but he doesn't really have the time to fully examine and try and translate everything that he sees in there. But as he follows this certain tunnel in there, he ends up in this room where there are all of these bodies in sort of like stone alcoves, let's say, and they've all had their eyes gauged out. And at some point in time he starts to hear voices who are saying that Abitium is lost, the gate should be left closed, I think, and Synchronous is dead. And when he looks back at the bodies again, it seems like their eyes are now open. So Vis naturally runs away at this point in time, and as he's running out of the temple, he notices that 2 people are running towards this, and so he quickly goes and hides. It is Viridius, and I don't actually remember who the second person was, and basically Viridius informs the other person that he needs to go back to the academy and search all of the dorms to try and figure out who is missing. And so Vis now knows that he has to hurry back to the academy because he cannot be spotted here, so he runs back to the academy. In his haste, unfortunately, his hands gets perforated on the fence, and so he makes his way back to his dormitory, runs in, kind of pretends to be asleep, and luckily Aiden covers for him because Aiden was awake the entire time, saw Vis come in, but when this person comes in to ask Aiden whether he's seen anything weird, whether anything is amiss, Aiden just says that nothing is amiss, that everything has been perfectly normal the past few hours, nothing has happened. Now, the next morning, Vis has this wound to deal with because the wound has been throbbing and the wound looks very bad, and he knows that he just cannot like ignore this. This is not going to go away, this is not going to heal naturally, and it's not going to be something that he can hide. So he has to orchestrate another injury. He orchestrates a sort of like fall in the cafeteria where a knife goes through his hand in order for him to go to the sick bay and be able to have his hand seen to. too, and at that point in time he also finds out that indeed somebody has instructed the healer to inform them if there are any sort of like weird injuries that are coming in, but because of the fact that like the entire mess hall saw what happened, like nobody is really questioning Viz's wounds. And now we are approaching the time of the Festival of the Ancestor, for which Viz will travel to I don't remember the place anymore, but it's this sort of like sacred mountain where there are a lot of tombs, and most of the big households have a tomb there, a mausoleum there. So the transfect of the school arrives at the Festival of the Ancestor, and basically they're informed that the transfect will be running back and forth incessantly throughout this weekend, because they know that Viz is running a little bit of a risk, because the Anguis could potentially target the transfect system, and so as a consequence they will have it run incessantly to avoid a targeting detected by the Anguis as well, because you don't have to register, so they don't know when Viz will be on it. Viz is greeted by a huge crowd because he's very famous now, and he is very much worried by this, because this means that there could be like Anguis assassins in there, but he's very quickly picked up by Ulsiskor, and Ulsiskor takes him to this private room in which he and Lanistia first kind of interrogate him about how his first semester has gone, and they very much indicate that they're very much disappointed with his lack of a progress at this point in time, because it's been one semester and he's still only in class 6, whereas he needs to make his way to class 3 prior to the Udicium at the end of the next semester. However, he is also pleasantly surprised to learn that Viz has been able to examine the first ruin. However, he indicates to Viz that he definitely needs to make his way to the other side of the island and inspect the second ruin as well. Lanistia also indicates to him in a private conversation that Ulsiskor was actually at the verge of kind of looking for alternative means, and that Viz definitely needs to make some progress in order to safeguard his future. Now Viz asks Ulsiskor for some tools, for him to create some tools for him, indicating that he would need to leave earlier from the festival because he actually thinks he knows how to get onto the other side of the island into the second ruin. Now Ulsiskor introduces him to his parents and to his wife Relucia, who turns out to be Sodacia, the woman who is the leader of the Anguis at this point in time, probably. Now Viz struggles to hide his surprise, however Relucia kind of covers for him with her exuberant performance and kind of pulls Viz away for a little bit of a walk together so that they can get to know one another. And in that conversation she clarifies to Viz that it was actually their intention for him to kill Estevan. However, there's only like 2 people or so within the Anguis society who are aware of this. All the rest will indeed think that Catenicus was the killer of Estevan and will see him as their enemy. And she indicates that, you know, he needs to do better. They'll see what they can do for him, and that he definitely has to make his way to the top of the standings by the end of the semester. They want him to choose to switch to religion. I'm not entirely sure whether this is indicated at this point in time in the book or at a later point in time, but in their plan is for him to switch loyalties to religion, and Viz kind of indicates that his idea was kind of to ask for a seat at like an island that's kind of like a location that's kind of far away from the center of the empire. It's still a position that he can ask for, but it will be a position that's kind of outside of the hierarchy to some extent, or like at the very outskirts of it. And Relucia kind of indicates that this is fine by them, that they can work with that. Now Viz returns to the party. They have a good time together, even though there's some tension between the parents of Ulsiskor and Ulsiskor himself about the accusations that Ulsiskor has placed at Viridius' feet. And then the time comes for Ulsiskor to make his excuses for Viz having to leave early. So he takes Viz to the transfect, and along his way he asks Viz about his true identity. Because Viz has basically been claiming that he's from this place called Aquiria, I think. And Ulsiskor has kind of indicates in this conversation that he realizes that that is impossible. That it is impossible for Viz to have this level of education and the skills if his story about his origins is true. However, Viz indicates that he does not want to share this information. He tells Ulsiskor, like, I will not let it interfere with my assignment for you. You have my word of that. And Ulsiskor kind of takes him at that word. So he takes him to the transfect, he kind of distracts the person who's running the transfect while Viz gets inside, leaves his bag with sort of like his spare clothing somewhere within the transfect, and makes his way to the other side of the transfect, where he basically attaches himself to, I believe, the underside of the transfect, so that when they are hurtling over the sea, he will be able to let go and drop. Now, the reason why he has to do this is because there's a sort of like protection around the island. So the island Solivagos has all these pre-cataclysm ruins on it, but it also has this sort of structure that is referred to as the seawall, and that you cannot kind of go through by any other means than through this transfect. Otherwise you would like end up dying. And so he couldn't like have made his way over via the sea. He has to kind of drop from the transfect, and so this is what he is doing now. And so when he has crossed the sort of like construction that indicates the barrier of the seawall, he lets go and he drops into the water, and he also drops one of the items that Osisgr has given him, because one of the items is sort of like a location stone for him to be able to find his way back to this exact spot, because he will have to be back at this exact spot when the final transfect passes, for him to be able to connect back magnetically to the cuff that he has left inside the transfect. He makes his way over to the island at this point in time and makes his way over to the ruin. And when he gets to the ruin, there is some writing on there, which he speaks out loud, and as a consequence the doors open to him. Now at first glance it's very similar to the ruin he has visited before. It has the same sort of writing that he can to some extent read, but not fully. But there's also a big maze in there. And when he approaches the maze, there is somebody who starts speaking to him, and this is like a ghostly person. It seems like it's somebody who has died, who indicates that he was a traitor, and who asks Viz whether he wants to run the labyrinth. Viz asks him to run the labyrinth for him, because in his speech there was something about like remnants protecting the way, and so the ghost, let's refer to him, runs the labyrinth and is kind of devoured by these beings within it. Viz decides he does not want to run the labyrinth, and he makes his way out of the ruins, and on his way out he is going through a forest when he stumbles upon a sort of like baby wolf that he kind of takes care of, and then he lets the pup go, but he does give him a name called Diago, which is basically his own name. He makes his way back to the sea where he has dropped the locator, and then using this sort of like mechanism of magneticism between the cuff that he has with him and the cuff that is on the transfect, he makes his way onto the transfect, and he's able to return to the academy. However, when he arrives, the teacher, who basically is like noting the names of all the students upon their return, asks him whether he's seen like the final student, because there's apparently still one student missing who didn't make it onto the final transfect. However, they find out the next day that he has actually passed away, and Viz is kind of worried that potentially the Anguis have killed him in order to place him at a higher class, because this now means that there's a spot opening up in class number 5 where he needs to make his way to. However, his teacher is still reluctant to place him there. He is the top of his class and he should definitely make it there, and the teacher of class number 5 also knows that Viz is the one who should be making his way into her class. However, the teacher kind of hesitates for a long time, until the point in which the teacher of class 5 kind of confronts him, and in that conversation a bet is basically placed so that he will fight against another student of class 6, the student that his teacher does want to see promote to class number 5. So basically they will fight it out for a position in class number 5, and Viz originally is quite confident in his position, even though this guy is basically like the champion of some sort of a national competition, I guess. He's kind of confident in his skills because he's been fighting every night or so in this fighting rink for years. However, it turns out that when they say a fight, that is not just like a fist fight straight away, but that it's like a fight that is fought through these sort of like will-imbued harnesses, and so it's the harnesses that fight one another and you have to control the harness. However, this is of course a method of fighting that Viz is very much unfamiliar with. So Emissa, who is the one who informs him of this, basically offers to teach him. However, he has made this deal with Aid Him in which he was going to teach him languages, so he reneges on Vis's opportunity to go and honor his duty to Aid Him. However, Aid Him is like, what the hell are you doing here? Obviously, we have to go and train you right now so that you can survive your fight tomorrow and make it into class number 5. So they train up Vis together in order for him to be able to confront this guy in the competition the next day. But on his way to the competition, Calidus kind of talks to him and kind of indicates that he also knows that Vis's story isn't fully accurate. There are inconsistencies within Vis's story, and he kind of has his suspicions that Vis is actually sort of like the secret bastard child to some sort of a senator and that he's hiding that fact. And so Vis kind of goes along with it, basically like save face, but they kind of end up on a sour note. However, Calidus is eventually there to spur his friend along in the competition. Now the competition doesn't go off great because Vis is definitely dealing with an opponent who knows what he's doing, so he definitely needs to stay on his toes. However, it turns out very early on that there's also a lot of sabotage involved because the armor that the other student is using seems to be not registering the blows that Vis is landing, and as a consequence, Vis is kind of like fighting for his life. He tries to get people to see the sabotage, but whenever he points it out, then all of a sudden the sabotage seems to stop, so he cannot really proceed that way without looking like a total coward. So in the end, his anger starts to rise and his anger issues take over, and he basically starts like bashing this guy's face into the ground until he has to give up. And then he kind of walks up to in the front of everybody and kind of like places his blade on the harness and like nothing happens, showing everybody that a lot of sabotage was involved. And that of course is how Vis makes it into class number 5. In class number 5 he makes a lot of progress easily, and I think he makes it into class number 4 pretty quickly. A little bit vague on those details, that I don't think that there's a big issue with getting into class number 4 anymore. But so in class number 4 he's now in the same class as Aqua was, and Aqua has basically been quite wary of him since the Naumickia because she noticed some inconsistencies with his story and the events that actually happened, and she's not sure about Vis and whether he's telling the truth. And she also apparently holds some suspicions about his quick rise within the rank, and she thinks that maybe he is doing some illegal activity to achieve this on his end. Now Aqua is very much at the top of class number 4, and their teachers in class number 4 is somebody who very much relies upon them kind of doing more than just being the smartest, being the best, because he quickly talks to Vis and kind of tells him like, you need to do better socially speaking. You need to stop having your lunch with Calidus. You need to like suck up to these 40-year-olds. You need to be able to like run a group or work together, in any case, communicate, charm a group, because the people who are going to end up in class number 3, the people who are, even the ones in class number 4, they're the ones who are going to be landing these high position roles, and these high position roles within the Senate require communication. They require you to be able to charm the hell out of the people around you, and so he is very much pushing Vis to be much more socially open than he wants to be, to try and create relationships within the group with his fellow students. And so when Vis is invited by the third years, by Indol, one of the third years, to accompany them on a trip to his sort of like summer home to train together after a sort of like festival that is about to come, then Vis really doesn't really have much of an option other than going along with that, because this teacher Skyttis is basically looking at him when he hears this invitation, and so it's clear from that look that he has to say yes, or otherwise he is definitely going to be lowered in the eyes of his teacher and maybe will even lose his 4th year position. And so Vis has to agree, but when he's agreed, that's when he finds out that the island that they want to take him to is the island of Zeus, basically his birth island. So he does not really want to see that happen. However, there isn't much that he can do about it, but he thinks like, okay, I'll just discuss it with Relucia when I'm at this festival that is about to come up, because she has also asked him to meet him at that festival again. So he has to go to this festival. He goes along with the four tiers after the Skittles guy once again basically like pressures him to accept their invitation, which of course will make it a little bit more difficult for him because he will have to sneak off from the group in order to be able to approach Relucia on his own. However, the group pretty quickly on kind of splinters at the festival between like the people who are very interested in the foundation side of things, which is this sort of like chess board game that they plays over there, and people who want to explore further. And so at some point Vis does find himself alone at this festival, where he is approached once again by Relucia, who indicates to him that she definitely wants him to go to the island of Zeus, and that maybe they even orchestrated it, but basically they want him to go there because the Senate will also be holding a meeting over there in which they will be exploring some secrets, because the entire Senate, I think, is going to be there like the first day, but then like the final day there's only going to be like the top of the top, and so she wants him to listen in on that conversation and report back to her using a sort of like stylus that is doubled to a stylus that she has, so whatever he writes with it they will see on their end as well. So Vis has no choice, he has to go through with this, but once Relucia kind of says goodbye to him, he does kind of follow her to figure out what she is up to, and he sees her meeting with another person who he does not know, and they're talking about certain things, but it's all super vague, and then she asks him to show sort of like a power that he has acquired, and then Vis kind of sees like there's this weird feeling in the air, and then Vis kind of sees him entering the house again. It's unclear what happened there, but we're just rolling along with the punches at this point in time. Vis returns back towards the sort of like meeting point that I had set out for the return to the academy. However, at some point he realizes that he's being followed. He assumes that he's being followed by two Anguis men who are trying to take revenge on him. However, at some point they lead him into this sort of like dark alley, and when he's fighting against them, somebody is like instructing them to stop, and then they inspect his eyes, and it is clear that he has not been using will. And so it turns out that Aqua had actually informed the teacher Skittles that she thought that Vis was using will to get to the top, and she had basically staked her whole career on this. She was so convinced of this. However, the fact that he didn't defend himself with will against these men is enough of a defense to renege her accusations, and so Skittles makes no secret of the fact that he thinks that Aqua has very much screwed up here. They return to the academy. Aqua is kind of persona non grata in the fourth year. She is not being given any of the questions anymore. She's clearly now bottom of the barrel within this class, and Vis's star just starts to rise. Somewhere around this time as well, Vis spots Belly and Calidus talking together at some point, and he at that point in time just assumes that they're probably like romantically engaged because they did spend time together in class 3 at some point. However, he does not confront Calidus about what took place within and between them. Calidus also warns Vis about some imbalances within the hierarchy, kind of indicating that there is some sort of a power struggle that seems to be happening between military, religion, and the governance, which are like the 3 pillars of this empire, and that there's also some sort of like messing with the mathematics, because strictly mathematically speaking you would think that there's like a same distribution amongst the ranks. However, it turns out that like the top ranks are actually getting much more will ceded to them than would be expected with a like clear division of the will ceding and giving and getting mechanism, and that is also part of what, you know, makes his father's position so fragile. But he also indicates to Vis that he shouldn't inform anybody about this, because this is information that he only has because of the fact that his father is in the censor office, and so his father has this information that is disposable, but this is information that definitely shouldn't make it out. Now, we are moving on to the part in which Vis is returning to the island of Zeus along with the other third year. So he is a fourth year, so he's the only fourth year who has been invited to this island along with the third years. When he arrives there, it is just a painful experience for him, because this is the first time that he spotted his native land again, and his native land in a way that is like very different from the way that he left it off. There's a lot of hierarchy structures now. There's a lot of changes that have taken place since he was last there. They are staying at the palace that he used to live at, and he can see a lot of changes there as well. Like there was this sort of like beautiful depiction of the history of Zeus on the outside of the palace in the past, and that has all been chiseled away to have like this sleek hierarchy look. And when he's introduced to Indol's father, he also spots his father's past advisor, Fabrik, over there. And Fabrik seems to be working for, or Fabrik sounds weird. Fabrik is also working for the hierarchy now, it seems, because he's a sextus, meaning he is receiving and he is seeding will, and he very much seems to be in the good graces of the hierarchy. Now, Vis kind of tries to hide at the back of the group so that this guy might not recognize him, because he's expecting to be recognized. You know, it's only been 3 years, he hasn't changed that much in the meantime, and this guy definitely, like, he wasn't on a one-to-one basis with him all of the time, but he definitely will have known what the Prince of Zeus looked like. So he's still very much kind of like upset with the changes that he sees, but he chooses a room within this palace that he can stay at, where he knows that there is an access to some sort of like underground tunnel network that he can use to spy on the senators whenever that conversation is going to arise. So they're all trading, it's serious business, and he definitely for the first time since joining the academy feels seriously challenged in the sort of like questions that they're tackling. He's learning a lot for the first time, it seems like, and he's definitely also like struggling a little bit when it comes to keeping up with them. Now, one of these days he is basically just like about to retire for bed. Misa had kind of asked him whether he wanted to go swimming with her, but he had said no. However, Indol, when he's talking to Vis, kind of indicates that, you know, like, that Misa was going to go and swim in the lagoon, to which Vis immediately runs outside because he knows that this is a very dangerous place to go swimming. So he basically saves Emisa's life. They basically shelter within this sort of like cave off of the shore, and Emisa indicates that she knows that Indol is going to change loyalties when he graduates from the academy. So he is from a military family, however he does not get along with his father at all, and so Misa knows that he is going to change to religion at the end. But she asks Vis not to tell anybody because this is something that Indol has told her in secret, and so she does not want to betray his confidence. Vis's fame, of course, only rises with this further act of heroism. However, when he's kind of recovering in his bed, he's visited by Ulsiskor and Lanistia. Ulsiskor had kind of already warned him to kind of take a step away from Emisa and kind of be on his guard, and this is of course not the best act to show that he's keeping his distance. However, he is happy with the fact that Vis was able to visit the other side of Solifagos and visit those ruins. He does ask Vis to run the labyrinth. Lanistia seems to want to tell him like don't risk your life, but Ulsiskor is very insistent that he will not consider his deal with Vis completed unless Vis goes all the way and runs the actual labyrinth as well. Now, because Vis has basically just spent a lot of time in cold water and cold and rough water, this is like the perfect opportunity for him to feign an illness so that he can spend the day within his chamber and hopefully find the opportunity to go and listen in on the senators. He manages to do so, and he's able to overhear some sort of conversation about them placing sort sort of like extra surveillance on certain families. So he writes down 3 of the 5 names that are mentioned within that meeting for Relucia to take note of, and he kind of keeps the 2 other names behind for his own investigations, perhaps later on. And throughout that conversation, it also becomes clear to him that basically the military side of leadership has been working together with the Anguis to create this conflict, because basically military has always been sort of like the strong pillar of the hierarchy, and as the Catalan Empire was expanding, military's importance was of course at the top of its range. However, now there's no real place left to conquer anymore, and so the importance of military has kind of been dwindling. This is why Osiscor thought that, you know, whatever Viridius is doing on Solivagus, it is probably a way for them to overtake importance from military. And so basically military had been kind of using the Anguis to create a sense of danger, to create a need for military to stay strong, a need for military to keep having this amount of people in it. As Vis makes his way back to his room, he is greeted within the tunnels by Fadrik, who basically has recognized Vis as being the Prince Diago, and he takes him to this room where he's basically been keeping all of the sort of like items that he was able to save from his family. And so Vis is able to kind of reminisce about past times and talk about his family and Zeus and the way that Zeus used to be, along with Fadrik, without having to put up any type of a mask and just be himself for once. And Fadrik also kind of talks to Vis about how he's certain that his father would have really been proud of Vis, and how he feels ashamed of his acts at this point in time, because this was the only way he saw to be able to protect as many of the inhabitants of Zeus as possible, was for him to kind of appease the current government and kind of work with the current government and make them think like has gone over to their side. It makes the islanders despise him, but it's also the best way that he has to still to some extent influence the decisions of the hierarchy. And so Vis definitely does also defend his actions and kind of forgives Fadrik for the choices that he has made. Now, the final thing I think I still need to really discuss about this time in Zeus is that Indol does indicate that he realized that Vis is from Zeus. Of course, he doesn't realize like the full extent of things, but he definitely knows that Vis is from there, and so this might come into play in book 2. It does not come into play in this one, but perhaps in next book it will come into play, the fact that he knows where Vis is originally from. He didn't originally take much sort of like stock in what was happening, like in the fact that he was from there and that he was keeping that secret. He didn't really place too much of an importance on that, but perhaps that will be changing in book 2. But so we make our way back to the academy, and the sort of like next part of our time starts there. He is in group class 4 still, but he wants to make his way to class 3, and Calidus kind of informs him that basically Belly has been sabotaging him or blackmailing him, because basically Calidus at some point in time, through his father and the censor office, was able to gather some information that is highly sensitive and that would really reflect badly upon Calidus's father if it was found out that, you know, his son had been able to access this highly sensitive hierarchy information. He had shared this information with Belly because he was attracted to Belly. He thought that they had something special going on. However, Belly like kept the document and then basically blackmailed Calidus, telling him that he needed to drop down to class number 7 as a way for her to have less competition within class 3. Now, this sparks Vis to want to take a little bit of a risk in order to get into class 3, because he has now decided to challenge Belly. So he kind of tricks Belly into a bet that she can beat him at foundation by the time in which they've kind of started this whole process. There's also been a lot of attention, not just from a lot of fellow students, but also from the teachers of class 4 and class 3. She basically accepts to fight him in a game of Foundation. The spoils that she gets is, I think that she gets to decide which class, like which type of government he will run for, and then he in turn asks her for her spots in class 3 if he were to win. Now, she is super confident, she's very good at Foundation. He's playing in such a way that he seems to be losing tiles for no reason early on. So she is very much overconfident about her abilities. However, she notices too late that he's basically forced her into an impossible position to recover from. In the moment in which she realizes this and she sort of starts to panic about the fact that she's going to lose her position in class 3, Vis kind of talks to her very quietly and is like, you know, if you return what you have from Calidus, then I will relent. I will let you go. And so Vis manages to get this done. Belly goes and grabs the documentation, hands it over to Calidus. Calidus goes and hides it and then shows us it, then pretends to have just burned it when Belly spots him afterwards. And then Vis, after all, destroys Belly in the game because, you know, he wants her to be aware of the consequences of her actions, or the consequences of having sabotaged and blackmailed a fellow student. And so he makes his way into class 3 in time for Udicium. He is now finally challenged. It is kind of like when it was on the time on the island of Zeus, like the questions that are coming his way are definitely up to par, definitely of a high level, and he's definitely at the bottom of the barrel within this class at this point in time. He's making slow progress at potentially catching up, and he does think that there are sort of 2 people within class 3 that he can probably get ahead of eventually. However, the teacher of class 3 once again is one of these teachers that doesn't really like him at all, and the date for the Udicium is actually pulled forward. So the date of the Udicium is going to take place within 2 weeks, and all that they're told at this point in this time is that each third will have to recruit 2 forts to help them along. And so the kind of manipulation starts of people being okay, the top people of the 4th class are definitely going to be taken by the top students within the 3rd class, but Vis very early on knows that he wants to recruit Calidus and aid him for his front. When he goes to inform Viridius of his choice, Viridius is kind of indicating you made a good choice, it's very important to choose people that you trust for this particular version of the Udicium. However, he also informs him that he will be speaking to both of these individually. Vis will not be allowed to know about what has been discussed, and when this conversation takes place, Aiden decides to withdraw. Now, Aiden's backstory I haven't touched upon yet, but so Aiden is basically from this other tribe that was also outside of the Catalan Empire for a long time, and he basically killed a few people when they started to come for them, and so he spent a year or so within a sapper to be able to as his punishment, and he's basically just being given a second chance at this point in time, a second chance that he doesn't want to waste. And he indicates that basically it was his father who managed to get this deal to get him into a sapper to save his life, and so he cannot put his life at jeopardy to the extent that this Udicium would require, or that whatever it is that Viridius discussed with him, it makes for him to be unable to comply, to go ahead and accept this offer, but that is nothing personal or anything like that, and Vis also doesn't take it personally at all. But this does mean that Vis has to look for another person that he will trust enough to be able to take part in the Udicium with him, and he doesn't really have many friends, but he ends up deciding that he is going to choose Aqua, because even though she has very much been fallen within the graces of everybody within his academy, she did very much apologize at the time that it was found out that her accusations were unfair and unjust, and she did seem to like genuinely feel sorry about the accusations that she's made and to genuinely repent. And so Calidus, Vis and Aqua basically spent the next 2 weeks kind of preparing together in order to try and prepare for this Judicium, even though of course they don't know what's coming their way, they don't know how they stand. And yeah, let's go into the Judicium. This is the final test for this semester, and we have quite a lot of people taking place. I think there are like 5 or 6 students within the thirds, and so they all have 2 people from the fourths that are accompanying them. And so the rules are laid out. Basically, there is this jewel that is called the Heart of Jovan that has to be returned to the temple, or like to a statue in any case. The person who returns the jewel, he gets their reward. If they're third, then they just win the Judicium, and so they get the rank of Dormitor, which is basically like the best students in that year. If a fourth is able to return the jewel, then they get whatever was promised to them in their private conversation with Viridius. Now, when a third wins, the fourths that were part of their team also get like a higher ranking and stuff like that. But so yeah, that is how it plays out. Everybody has like a stone through which they can be tracked, and that stone needs to be on them when they return the jewel. Everybody has like a bead that they ingest, and if the tracking stone and the bead are separated from one another, then a security team will come to retrieve you and you are out of the competition. And then most people also have like a stone that they can use to track other teams, except for the lowest ranked team, which is a team of Vis. So Vis and his team immediately kind of step towards the west, I believe it is, towards the sort of like outskirts of the arena, because basically they cannot cross the rivers. And Vis very early on regurgitates the bead that he had to swallow, so that he is able to have his bead and his tracking stone be removed from his person without, you know, the team being disqualified. This, he actually needs to be able to go to the temple and run the labyrinth, because he thinks that this is sort of like his only and best opportunity to do so. However, that's of course not what he's telling his team. However, very shortly afterwards, they are attacked by the team of Outtro, who's always had it out for him because his sister, I believe, was killed in the Namikia, and he believes that, you know, if he hadn't gone back to save Aqua, he could have killed Esteban earlier, and so he could have saved the life of Outro's sister. But so Outtro is teamed up with Belly, who obviously has a grudge against Vis because of losing her spots in the class 3 just a few weeks earlier. And so they kind of roughen the guys up. Vis falls unconscious for the 20,000th time, and he wakes up strapped to a tree. Now, they offer Calidus and Aqua the opportunity to jump teams, which Calidus, being the loyal guy he's always been, of course refuses, but Aqua kind of takes them up on their deal. They're kind of worried whether Aqua is just like playing the other guys two-way or whether she's actually jumped ships, but Aqua does return later on with in order to be able to unstrap them, and they kind of come up with this plan where she's going to go back to Outtro and Belly, pretending that, you know, like everything is fine, she was just out on patrol, and she's gonna try and retrieve Vis's tracking stone so that they can have those back. I think she's also going to like remove their tracking stone so that the security team will disable this team. Meanwhile, Calidus and Vis, meanwhile, are going to try and steal a tracking tablet from the security teams. All the security teams have some sort of a tracking tablet with which they can see the location of everybody. So if they can get their hands on that, then they will be then they will have a big advantage, because they'll be able to see where all the teams are. Vis and Calidus approach the security team, and they kind of come up with this plan in order to kind of like shift attention away. So Calidus is going to make a distraction to draw the security team away from the fire, and Vis is going to steal the tracking tablet in the meantime. The plan goes according to plan, but unfortunately, like, there's a quite visceral reaction from the security team when Viz steals the tracking tablet. There's so much force involved that Viz finds that all to be a little bit dodgy. However, he has no time. He needs to make his way to the labyrinth. He has kind of agreed with Caldus and Aqua that they would meet up in the morning at a certain location, indicating, like, you know, if something goes wrong and we get split up, I might have to, like, run further away in order to get rid of these guys chasing me, and so that way he's already kind of prepared them for the fact that he might you know, not be there immediately, and so he's already kind of covered for himself, being able to get some time to run the labyrinth. So Viz makes his way over to the labyrinth, and along the way he is met with Puppy Diago, so with the wolf Diago, who's trying to keep Viz away from the labyrinth, it seems like. Viz, however, ignores his warnings and enters into the labyrinth, and when he is met like one of these specters again, who is asking him if he wants to run the labyrinth, he does first ask them to run the labyrinth for him. He asks them some 4 times, I believe. Every single time he's kind of gets a little bit more knowledge about like where the remnant starts their run and what type of choices they're making, and so based off of that he realizes that they're always going to make like the smartest choice, so they're always choosing the shortest distance. So if with his foundation brain he can then kind of like anticipate, because their choices is always logical, so he can also play with that and then figure out what he should be doing at every point within the labyrinth. So he's kind of observed the game for a while, and now he knows how he wants to run it. So he's running the labyrinth, counting down in his head to make sure that he's got the proper timing down. However, his timing goes out the window when he spots the corpse of Belly. So apparently Belly had gone into the labyrinth as well to run it herself, and it did not go well for her. He's so startled by spotting Belly, who had of course not anticipated at all, that he loses track of time. He stops counting, and so he doesn't know how much time he has potentially lost on this. So all things could still go very, very wrong, but luckily he still makes it out of the labyrinth intact, just in time before the remnants reach him. And once he steps through the labyrinth on the other side, the remnants kind of like, they stop there, they don't follow him out. Now he's in another room where there's sort of like a circular platform in the middle with these spikes all pointing to inside, which he weirdly enough dares to step into, and once he's there, it's sort of like a weird feeling overcomes him, as if the air is being like sucked out of him. He faints for the 20,000th time, and when he awakens, there are these sort of like human spectral beings that are around him, and he is planning to make a run for it. However, he doesn't really see another way out except for going back through the labyrinth, which he would really hope not to do. However, if he's going to be running from this side of the labyrinth, it is going to be much easier than from the other side. However, like, there's a message etched into his arm which says wait. So he waits a little bit longer, and then a message on his other arm starts to appear which says so he's about to say run, and so he makes a run for it. However, he's also been very badly injured in his time there, so there's an injury to one of his arms that he's dealing with as well, that's very much paining him. However, he does make his way through the labyrinth without any issue, running outside, trying to get to the outside of the temple. Right before reaching it, the sort of like human specters meet up with him, and they're kind of indicating that he has to complete the journey, so he cannot just bail halfway through. But the wolf has made its way inside, and so Diago saves Viz from these human spectral creatures. They make a run for it outside. They're still being chased, but along with Diago there, he's able to fend them off, and until the point where he passes out because of the pain of his injury. When he wakes up, Wolf Diago is still there, however, and he seems to be quite recovered because he was also quite badly injured during those fights. However, he just like walks away from Vis, and so Vis is left on his own again to go back and meet up with his friends. He informs them, of course, of the injury, but he hides the part of his arms where the message "wait" and "run" were visible. Because of course that he wouldn't be able to explain all that well. And Aqua, Calidus and Vis kind of decide to split up again. So Calidus is going to go towards the entrance of the academy where the temple is, where they're about to return the Heart of Joven. So he's going to scope out over there, and Aqua and Vis, they are going to continue along. However, when they're on their way closer to the temple, they run across this site where there's a lot of dead bodies of students, but also dead bodies of security teams. And so at that point in time, a few things slot into space, because I'd already mentioned that Vis noticed like the extreme level of violence with the security team that they faced earlier, but also he stole a cloak from them, and that cloak had like a lot of blood on it, which also worried him a lot. And so now these things kind of click into place, and he realizes that this is sort of like the next plot on the side of the Anguis, that this is what they were preparing for, to infiltrate the Eudicium and to try to like massively assassinate these important kids of important people within the hierarchy. So they have to go and warn people in the competition. So they spot that Indol and Emissa are basically still at the Heart of Joven, that they are over there, and so they go over there to try and warn them. I'm a bit hazy on the full sort of like timing here, but definitely they go to warn Indol, they go to warn Emissa, and at some point Vis also informs Aqua that she has to go to Calidus and inform Calidus and get him safely to the academy. And so Indol is of course originally skeptical, but when they show him one of the severed arms that they found in that mass grave, he is able to turn around. And Vis also tries to kind of get him to his side by letting him know that he knows that he will switch to religion, and that Emissa told him that. And Indol is kind of startled by that, because he says like, yeah, that is true. However, I've never told Emissa that I was going to do this. Now when they're warning Emissa's team, they find the rest of her team. However, they do not find Emissa herself. She's already gone off to the temple, and so they run after Emissa to go to the temple, and so Vis goes off to the temple by himself to try and track Emissa down and inform her of what is going on. When he enters the temple, he's first met by this guy from the Anguis team, the guy who was having the meeting with Relucia at the festival. And so this guy is basically able to sort of like, I don't know, travel through space or something like that, because he kind of appears out of nowhere behind Vis at some point in time, but he leaves Vis unharmed, but he does indicate to Vis that he might lose that arm that has been fully hurting him. And he also indicates that he realizes that Vis has run the labyrinth successfully. Vis makes it to the top of the temple, where there is this guy who immediately recognizes him as Catanicus and clearly does not know that Vis is supposed to kill Esteban in the Namikia, so he attacks Vis. Vis and Emissa fight him off, and they end up successfully killing the guy. However, at the end of this, Emissa is kind of worried about what she sees in Vis. She sees something that kind of puts her hackles up and that makes her suspicious, and so she asks Vis to hand over the Heart of Joven to her. And when he does so, like, I don't know, he basically just like drops it at her feet, and then she puts a spear through his chest. And he, at that point in time, was basically like hanging off of the side of the temple, so he falls down. And in the moment of his fall, the Heart of Joven basically like snaps back into his hand somehow. And when he lands in some sort of a puddle, and he realizes that the cut to his chest is actually not as bad as it's supposed to be. So he kind of makes a run for it towards the academy, and along the way he finds Calidus. Calidus is very badly wounded, so he drags him along with him towards the academy. However, Calidus passes away on the way to the academy. At the academy, everybody's kind of gathered. Viridius is giving a speech about what has just happened, and Vis interrupts the speech by putting the heart of Joven back into the statue and fainting. He is now, of course, Durmitor. He has technically won the Judicium and can take any spot that he wants. He awakens to find Viridius in his room. Viridius, who's kind of asking him, like, okay, did you, like, I know you ran the labyrinth, there isn't much time, you have to trust me. And like trying to tell him, like, okay, Emissa didn't really want to kill you, she just saw that your blood had been tainted, which apparently happens when you run the labyrinth successfully, and so she had no choice, but we don't find out more about why she had no choice and all those things. However, Vis is definitely not going to trust Viridius, definitely not at this point in time, and so Viridius wants him to choose a specific calling, like he wants a specific position, now that he as Durmitor has the opportunity to choose whatever position he wants to. However, when the officials come in to give Vis his choice, Vis decides to go another route. He does not choose the plan that he originally had to go to sort of like a very remote section of the world, but he decides to choose the position at the censor office so that he can work underneath the father of Calidus. This is where we leave off the main storyline. However, there are two epilogues that will absolutely change everything about this ending, because in epilogue number 1 we return to the labyrinth, we return to the moment in which Vis had run the labyrinth successfully and he was standing on the platform in the circular platform in the other room. So he awakens there, and when he returns back to, and the same thing happens again, he has the message of wait, the message of run is starting to appear. However, when he returns to the labyrinth this time around, there's another message there. The message kind of indicates that the way through requires a sacrifice, and so when he tries to go through the labyrinth again, he feels this sort of like very sharp pain, and the arm that was injured basically disappears, and he loses conscious over the shock, and when he awakens he's in some sort of like snow-covered ground, met by two people who kind of inform him that somebody else from his world is about to appear, indicating that he is actually now in a sort of like parallel world. And in the second epilogue we see him awaken in a room somewhere, and there he's greeted by some guy who is actually Kyror, and Kyror indicates to Vis that they have to be quick because they have to take action in order to save Vis's life over in Res, which we assume then is the normal world that he inhabits. So yeah, split, not personalities, but split bodies. So we have two Vises now for the second book. So this is where the recap ends, and we can go into some speculation. I think the first thing that I should talk about is that I kind of glazed over the relationship between Vis and Emissa, because the relationship had been slowly building through smaller interactions throughout the first half of the book that I didn't really go into within this recap all that much. But so basically, by the time in which he saves her from drowning, they're actually a couple together. In spite of the fact that in the recap I also mentioned that when Vis originally woke in the academy, he was given a glass of water that turned out to be poisonous afterwards, and it was actually Emissa who handed it over to him. And so Emissa was always sort of like on his danger radar, or like Siskar had definitely kind of indicated that he should keep an eye out for these 3 students who were there at the time. And I definitely think that probably we should take a look back at that, because I don't think it was Emissa, or maybe it was, maybe she was just playing the long game and like pretending to like Vis and all of that, but actually was out for him from the beginning. But I don't really think so. I do think that something between them changed the moment that Vis came back from the labyrinth. However, when it comes to the poisoning, he was poisoned, and we did not find out who poisoned him throughout this book. So one of the other 2 is still a potential poisoner. So I do definitely think that that is something that we could look into. And of course it was heartbreaking for him to have Emissa be the one to basically try and kill him at the very end. And I don't really know why she would try to kill him over his blood being tainted. And there was also a blood test that was performed by the Senate, which I've heard people speculate is for this very same reason, that they wanted to figure out if somebody had tainted blood, before they went to the academy, or maybe they will take blood before and after as a sort of like comparison thing. So this seems to be something that people are aware of to some level. I mean, some of these people seem to be more sort of on the in about what had been going on in the academy, and so I'm curious to see. I mean, I expect us to find out a little bit more about that, find out a little bit more about what actually was going on, what they have uncovered through there. And based off of the sort of like skills of the Anguis guy who was meeting Relucia, I do believe that this guy also has the same power. He has run the labyrinth, and it seems his power might be sort of like being able to switch between the different realities, because we see him kind of like becoming invisible and appearing in another place, but perhaps he's just stepped into the other reality. Maybe that's what is happening, or maybe it's some sort of like time mess, but I don't really think it's time. I do think it's more something like the parallel worlds, and he's able to play with them. However, when it comes to the parallel worlds, I'm also a little bit unsure about what we're doing there, because we had that message early on about Abitium being lost and Synchronous being dead. And so in the end we know that Vis is, like the second Vis, is in Abitium, so Abitium seems to be the name of a parallel world, which means that Synchronous is probably also the name of a parallel world, which has then died. So that, but what do we mean with Abitium is lost? Because, you know, Vis has just moved in there, and that does not sound like a very positive message. And what is Lyceum then? Because we have Lyceum mentioned. In my name, in my word, in my like vocabulary, Lyceum is school. So I mean, for me, Lyceum just seems sort of like the gateway between these three different realms. But I could be totally wrong about that, of course. And it'll be interesting, because I guess in this next book we'll have two Vises, I assume. We'll have like, I expect us to divide our attention between two perspectives, the Vis on Res and the Vis on Abitium. And I'm guessing that the Vis on Abitium is going to meet, like, is going to spot those black pyramids that Vis at one point saw when he was fighting Estevan in the Naumickia, which also might mean that this power that the Anguis were using is like a power that is coming from a different realm. And Estevan was indicating that there is something that made the Catalan Empire attack Zeus. And at some point in time, Vis kind of confronts Relucia about it, but she doesn't really seem to know, and he's asking her if this power was the reason, and she's indicating like, I don't really know, but it wouldn't surprise me. So perhaps the Zeus Empire actually knew about this power before already. However, in that case, I'm kind of wondering how this escaped like Vis's attention, how Vis would not have been aware of this, being a prince of the realm and being somebody who was already like, I don't know how old he was at that point in time, but he must have been some like 12 years or so by the time that he was that he had to leave Zeus. Now, I don't really have much other speculations about what is coming next. I definitely expect us to meet back with Aiden at some point in time, and for the sort of like fraught relationship with Emissa and Aqua to play some sort of a role, because Aqua appears to have ignored Vis's instructions to go and warn Calidus. Perhaps there is her side of the story that kind of indicates why this happened, or how she was detained from doing so. But of course, because Calidus died, Vis is going to have some very strong negative feelings towards Aqua as a consequence, I'm sure. But as he's going to go to the censor office, I don't really know like what is going to go into play there, because we really have a somewhat of a clean slate now when it comes to his storyline. We're going to a very new place. We have kind of to some extent solved the questions that Ulsiskar wanted us answered. So where are we going to take this story from here? That, to me, is somewhat unclear. To me, it's like an open book, it can go anywhere again. But I'm definitely very much looking forward to it, and I'm hoping that we finally find out a little bit more about this cataclysm, because there's a lot of references to the pre-cataclysm artifacts and stuff like that, and the willpower is coming from there. However, we really don't know anything about it. Like, what is the cataclysm? What was there before the cataclysm? Was it like a sort of like end of humanity type of event, or was it, I don't know, I really have no idea what it is. It kind of makes me think of like the synchronous is dead aspect of this. Maybe this world also at some point in time went through this cataclysm that kind of annihilated whatever came before. But I would love some clarification on what actually happened, and I'm sure, knowing James Islington, that it's going to be something mind-blowing, because in his Lacanius trilogy there was a lot of play happening with time. That's also why I kind of believe that this is not going to play with time, because it would be doing the same thing over. So I do think we have to look more along the multiple dimensions, being able to hop over and stuff like that. And what I'm actually just wondering is whether the power to hop over between different dimensions may not have had some way, in some way have been responsible for the cataclysm, and that is why Emissa is kind of like worried about this and wanted to destroy him, and she realized that he has this power. Maybe she is representing some sort of a group who is trying to destroy all these people that have these powers, whereas Viridius is clearly on the other camp, because he, or like clearly is not even sure, of course, because we don't really know that he is behind these acts, behind all of these students being killed in recent years. However, he is the one who kind of moved the academy to this island, which does definitely make it seem like he wanted to investigate these temples, but perhaps he was actually there to kind of have control over the situation, though then it appears that he didn't really have much control and wasn't really doing a good job. So I do think that Viridius is probably involved in having these students run the labyrinth and in all of these deaths on the island in the past few years. But Emissa might actually be representing an entirely different camp. Or I don't know what they're trying to achieve. Or maybe the problem is that he didn't go through the full journey, because, you know, these sort of like spectral images were saying that he had to complete a journey, and so she would like rather like kill him because he's like a failed experiment that is like a dangerous thing to have out there. And what they're actually trying to achieve is for somebody to do the full journey, whatever the full journey might be. But so yeah, enough with the speculation. We will know very shortly, because tomorrow, for me in any case, is when this book is landing in the, well, not in the mailbox, but when it is landing in stores. However, it's a bank holiday over here, so stores will not be open, so, which is a very big shame, because yeah, I want to jump into this as quickly as possible. I still have some time off at this point in time, and so it would be ideal to get to read 3 full days of this book rather than 2 if I only get my hands on it on the 12th. But yeah, we'll see what happens. You know, in any case, I'll definitely read it as soon as I'm able to, as soon as I can get my hands on it. But so yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and let me know what your thoughts and feelings are about what is going to be happening in book number 2, and see you guys for another video. Bye!